So welcome to day 2. Thank you for turning up, first of all. That's all you needed to do, so well done, everybody. We begin this morning with a look at ways to elicit behaviour change across public sector entities. And joining us to share his perspective and experience is Director of BehaviourWorks Australia, Professor Liam Smith. Since founding BehaviourWorks in 2010, Liam has led its significant growth, building a research team of 35 experts who've delivered over 700 projects with government and industry partners across social, financial, health and environmental issues. A prolific researcher and lead editor of Inspiring Change, Liam also serves on the board of Inclusive Australia, the Biodiversity Council and South East Waters Customer Engagement Council. Now, we probably won't have time for questions, unfortunately, but you will be able to chat to Liam during morning tea. So can we please welcome Professor Liam Smith.
Sorry. Thanks, Di. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you for having me, and thanks for being willing to listen to a behavioural scientist talk a little bit about some thoughts about how behavioural science may be able to contribute to the field of work that you do. I'll talk a little bit about that at the start, but before I start saying anything, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So, what I'll cover today spans, I guess, 3 broad topics. The first one I want to cover is what we share in common. When I say we, I'm an academic, but I'm also a behavioural scientist, and I assume most of the people in the room are performance auditors. And I've spent a bit of time learning a bit about performance auditing because I didn't know a lot about it before, or at least I thought I didn't. But in the process of trying to learn about it, I got hold of this book. Some of you may know this book. It was given to me by my stepfather, who was a performance auditor for 30 years. It's surprising I didn't know much about performance auditing, but then it was nice to learn a little bit more. And I said, I thought I didn't know a lot about it, but actually I do, because the overlap between what you do and what I do is actually significant. The second thing I want to talk to you about is why behaviour change approaches can be really helpful in trying to get, in doing the work you do. And in fact, any work that government does. And I'll give you some rationale and reasons as to why I think behavioural science is a good approach. And the final thing I want to get to is some tools, some approaches for behaviour change that you might take forward into your work. I'm not going to give you the full gamut. I'll give you some of those tools and hopefully they'll be helpful. So starting with what we'll share in common. In looking through that book and talking to my stepfather, I sort of gleaned there were 7 kind of things that, or principles or ethical underpinning for what a performance auditor does. You can see those down on the column on the left. Independence, evidence-based approach, transparency, accountability, public interest and value, a professional approach, continuous improvement, and the 3 E's as they're known, I believe. And I think about what a behavioural scientist does and a performance auditor does, and they're almost the same. These are principles that we live by in my day-to-day life as an academic and as a behavioural scientist. We do all those things too. So there's a lot in common. I think there could be much more exchange between academia, as I heard there was a little bit yesterday, between academia and performance auditing. But the one I did want to just really lean into, and the space where I think we have something to contribute, is around the 3 E's, and particularly the efficiency and effectiveness part of the 3 E's. So I'm going to start with a story, and I can imagine a situation where a performance auditor has done some work and decided that and made a recommendation for an organisation to be more efficient. And that could be efficient in the sense of being efficient. You're efficient, but also efficient in terms of energy. And just bear with me for a minute, because the story will have meaning shortly. And I turned to a light switch, which is something we want people to do when they leave the room, turn off a light. And someone taking that performance audit and implementing it might think, how am I going to do that? And this happened at my university, and a group called the Office of Environment and Sustainability decided that the best way to convince people to switch off the light when they left the room was to put a little sign there that said, if you switch off the light, you'll help save greenhouse gas emissions. You're a bunch of academics, you believe in climate change, if you switch off the light, it'll help emissions. Now, this worked terribly. It made no effect at all. So the Office of Environment and Sustainability went back to the drawing board and decided they better need to have a look at what else they could do. And they thought maybe the reason why people don't switch off the light is because they don't know where it is. So we got a sign that told us where the light switch was, right? So now it saves the climate and we know where it is, so we've got no excuses. Well, that failed miserably as well. No one turned off the light. So the Office of Environment and Sustainability went back and thought, well, how do we get behaviour change? I think what some people must think that if you turn the light off and on again, it uses up more energy than if you more energy than if you left it off or on or whatever. So they created these nice big signs. These are real photos from my university. Nice big signs that say, hey, if you switch it on and off, it uses more. It uses less than if you leave it on, whatever, right? Well, that didn't work either. So someone took it into their own hands and created their own sign, which is trying to encourage people to turn the lights off. Now, this is not uncommon. You've probably seen it in your kitchens, in your workplace kitchens, and in other places where we're trying to get behaviour change, but we're just sort of guessing about what might work. I've got another couple of examples that are probably a little less trivial, but I'm using a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire template to help you try and understand how guesswork can happen. This is a great study that was done a little while ago in West Australia. Some of you might be familiar with it. The decision was made that to give teenagers baby simulators that cried during the night and simulated what it was like to become a mother or a parent. And the objective really was to try and discourage teen pregnancies. So what happened when they gave people these simulated dolls? Did it reduce teen pregnancy, increase, have no effect, or increase baby bonus claims? Who thinks A? Who thinks B? Who thinks C? And who thinks D? The point is you don't know, right? But yet a whole program was launched around releasing these babies. Luckily, good evidence and evaluation was done, and it increased. The researchers who conducted the study said, unfortunately, these were not the results we were hoping for. But it shows good M&E is a good thing to do, right? And then perhaps one that's another just example of the Scared Straight program. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's very common in the US. It's about exposing juveniles that are going off the tracks to criminals, essentially. And what has we found over several studies? Does it work? Does it backfire? Does it have no effect? Or does it actually scare the criminals? Who thinks A? I've primed you all. Who thinks B? Yes, you are right. It backfired. In fact, people were more likely to be recidivists if they were part of that program. The point of making these stories is really to talk to you about the danger of just wading in without using behavioural science. Just jumping in and going, I know what'll work. And it's a really dangerous thing to do from a behavioural science perspective. If it's about switching off the light in a lunchroom, okay, maybe we can forgive that. But if it's about, the lives of juveniles, that's a significant thing, right? We want to do some science to make sure it works. So that's the evidence that underpins the Scared Straight. Incidentally, I think about a third of US states still have a Scared Straight program, despite the fact that it's been proven to not work. In fact, to cause the opposite effect. So why? Why is this like? Why don't these things work? Well, I think the first thing is that the people we're trying to change are often not like us. They're different from us. They think differently. They care about different things. If people cared about the same things that we did, they'd probably listen to our messages and they'd probably do what we want to do. But our audiences are different. They're not like us. And if there's one thing you learn today, that's probably the most important thing, is that if you're thinking of something that might work and you're using yourself as the person to judge it on, you're making a faulty assumption. The people you're trying to change are different to you. And the key is to try and get into their heads and understand them in order to try and do that. And understand the audit process really allows you to do that, which is great. And the other thing, of course, which you see there is, we often get fixated on one tool. This is the thing we need to do. I need to put up a poster. I got this idea to expose people to criminals. Or these simulator babies that's going to work because everyone hates waking up in the night 5 times or whatever, right? So we think, but that's the one tool. And they don't always think, what other tools could I use? What else is there? What other options are there? As the great Maslow said, I suppose it is tempting. The only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. So that's a little bit about the premise of how we're similar, but also why behaviour change, the premise for why behaviour change approaches are valuable. So I'm just going to go through some reasons why I really think, and I've given this part of the talk many times, why behaviour change approaches are useful to use. And I think the most important is it works. So behaviour change approaches have been used for many, many, many things. In this case, it's road fatalities in Australia. Sure, cars are safer now, but there's a lot more of them. But if you imagine what it was like, and those who are a bit older, what the attitude to things like speeding and drink driving was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that's changed a lot. And I think that is a lot to do, so has enforcement, so has campaigning. And these behaviour change tools have been very effective at reducing fatalities down from close to 4,000 down to, as we see the numbers here. So they work. Behaviour change approaches can be cheaper. This is a great example from my home state of Victoria, where a campaign was run during the Millennium Drought to try and get people to save water in their households. There was a campaign run, the Target 155 campaign. I think you had something similar here in West Australia. I know Queensland and New South Wales also had similar programs. And a campaign was run and it cost about $30 million to run the campaign. The other solution to running out of water is to build a desalination plant. And I understand you've got 2 here, is it? The cost of the desal plant in Victoria is about $8 billion. And every time we order from it, we pay more. The water authorities have to say, okay, our storages are here, we want some more water, and they'll order it. The reason why I raised these two to compare them is because the money that was saved out of the Target 155 campaign, the water that was saved out of the Target 155 campaign, roughly equivalent to the amount of water that a desalination plant, this desal, can produce. So pretty much equivalent in terms of water. One cost 30 million, the other cost 8 billion and counting. So it can be cheaper. It can be more immediate, so we can see change more quickly. If you think about the future of vehicles, maybe they'll be driverless, maybe they'll never have an accident, maybe it'll be a wonderful, perfect kind of sci-fi world. But right now we need people to drive slowly, we need people or drive at the speed limit, to not drink and drive, to drive safely, to wear seatbelts, etc. And we get that safety benefit now. We don't have to wait for the tech to come and fix up, so it can be more immediate. I really like this one. This is 2 experiments we ran with our EPA, our Environmental Protection Authority, around trying to get, in the first case, people to store chemicals correctly. Electroplaters are an organisation that they're a dying industry, and they also have very, very toxic chemicals that they use. So in other words, they're a high risk, right? So there's a high risk of them dumping, because storing and disposing correctly costs a lot of money. And so there was a crackdown on electroplaters they were doing, and we sent them this sheet that said, these are the things to do and not do in case the auditor, in case the regulator comes knocking on your door. The other one was around a similar issue with dumping into a stormwater drain, not specific to electroplaters. But we were very specific about what to do and not do. And when the regulator came knocking on the door, they found a couple of things. First was the door wasn't slammed on their face, which is kind of nice, which often happens when you're in a regulation event. People were much more happy to receive them. That's anecdotal, but we got it from a number of inspectors that they said that. The second thing was they were really keen to show them how they were following these simple things. It says, do this, don't do this. I haven't done that, I have done that. Look, I must be in compliant with the law. And the third thing, which was an unexpected learning, was that many of them stuck it up on their kitchen walls or wherever, somewhere in the office. And when we asked why they did that, they said, because it was laminated. It's funny how you learn some random things. So next time you send out advice, I'd suggest laminating it, right? Like people don't like to throw laminated stuff out. It must have more importance. And the final one, which I won't dwell into too much, but we know that behaviour change in one particular area or issue can actually generate support for policy in that same space. The example here is around wind farms. Great study was done maybe 10 years ago by a guy called John Thurgeson, his PhD student, Catherine Noblet. And they looked at people who were doing environmental behaviours and their support for wind farms. And what he found was they correlated, and that's not a surprise, right? If more people, turn off the tap when they brush their teeth and install energy efficiency appliances and do all those really good things, they're also more likely to support wind farms. It probably makes a lot of sense. The interesting thing about this study is they actually controlled for attitude. What does that mean? Two people cared the same about environment, but one was doing more as well as caring, were also more supportive of policy. So something happens when you do a behaviour that changes inside your mind. It changes who you are. We learn about who we are from what we do, as well as our upbringing and our attitudes and our parents, all those things, they influence us. But we also watch our own behaviour and learn about who we are. There are some studies and experiments that are great from a while ago now, but they were trying to get people to care more and do more for homeless people. And what they did was give them a dollar coin or some sort of small coin. They actually gave them the money and said, see that homeless person? Put it in their hat. I've given you the money. All you have to do is go and drop it in. And we saw that those people were more predisposed and more happy to do other things for homeless people as a result. We learn about who we are from what we do. So it's always good to play back things that people do to people, because that can lead to policy support. And I guess the last thing is, and I think most people here work in governments, behaviour change is kind of what you do. Most government, almost everyone, and we work with a lot of government departments in a lot of states, including here in West Australia. If you really drill into them and ask what their job is for and why they're doing their job, at some point you will get to behaviour change. Someone needs to do something differently. And so it's surprising, and this is a quote from Elder Shafir, who wrote this great book about 10 years ago now, I guess, that said, successful policy must depend on a thorough understanding of human behaviour. It is therefore remarkable how small a role the attempt to understand human behaviour has played in policy circles. There are the reasons why, a recap of the reasons why behaviour change approaches might be useful or helpful to the work that you do. They can have impact, they're cheaper, they can complement technology or be faster than technology and be immediate, they can lead to attitude or cultural change, and basically it's what you, and I think auditors, do. At the end of an audit, someone probably needs to do something differently, and that's the first question we ask in behavioural science. Who needs to do what differently? So now the third part of the talk that I want to get to is to talk about changing behaviour. Changing behaviour is actually a lot of effort and a lot of work. My research unit published a book on it yesterday, and I'm going to give you a couple of questions and the chance to win one of those books in a minute. Lucky you. And So there's a lot of work that goes into behaviour change. But I did want to, and a lot of process and a lot of structure into the work we do. But I did just want to give you a flavour and some tools and tips and ideas and things that you might be able to think about and use fairly quickly and immediately. And the first one, I would say, the first kind of thing that's probably most important, sorry, that's our methodology, which I'll talk about in a minute. And actually we're going to look at this bit here. This is the part that I'm going to talk mostly about of our methodology. And this method is not rocket science, by the way. It basically says understand a problem, work out what behaviour to change, then understand why people do and don't do that behaviour, and then test stuff to see if it works. Pretty straightforward. Probably not dissimilar to what you do in an audit, right? And so one of the first questions we ask in this is that last wedge in the first semicircle, identify priority behaviours. And we spend a lot of time trying to answer the question of who needs to do what differently, to choose behaviours specifically and wisely. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. We've done this for environmental issues, for social issues. We've done it to try and choose what behaviour should we encourage to reduce antimicrobial resistance. And it's a really important thing to do because what it does is it sets you up well for using behavioural change techniques. If you've chosen your behaviour and you've thought a lot about it, you'll be able to use behavioural science better and you're more likely to be effective. So choosing is important. The second thing is to understand drivers and barriers. That's important. And then match interventions to drivers. So I'm just going to cover these. This is an aerial photo of Townsville, taken about, it's actually quite old now, from Google Earth, I think, from about 10 years ago. One of the questions that you might ask if you're thinking about how a household can save energy is what behaviour should we encourage a household to do? And that's exactly what some research did about maybe 15 or 16 years ago. And they came up with 243 different things. Now, remember what I said? Behavioural science works best when we're specific, when we choose one of those 243 things. So we want to choose one that's important, right? We don't want to choose anything. We just go, we'll just get people to insulate or buy an efficient washing machine, right? We could do that, but it wouldn't be very scientific. So what the group of researchers, which we were involved in on the side, we were an evaluation group evaluating the process, was to rank each of those 243 different behaviours on two things. Number one, how much energy would it save if they did it? And number two, how likely is the audience to do it? Some of those behaviours might be quite expensive and therefore it's very unlikely they'll do it. Some of them might be cheap but not very effective. So you can imagine a matrix of impact and likelihood, and we've used this in a lot of case studies to try and identify priority behaviours. In this case, number one priority behaviour that came out on top, painting your roof white. And so you see on the left-hand side there is a group of houses that have in fact it was two behaviours. For new builds, it was installing a white roof, and for an old build, it was painting your roof white. And so we've got a snapshot here on the left, the new build, all white. On the right, old build. But a lot of those houses you'll see have white roofs or pale coloured roofs. And that's because the city of Townsville said, right, that's what we're going for. We've heard, and I'm yet to see this verified, but you can get up to a 70% efficiency gain from painting your roof white. That's pretty big, right? That's huge. So let's go for that. So they set up paint stalls at the local Bunnings shop. They backed small business. They trained people in safety. They did a whole bunch of things, all to enable that to happen. And the efficiency gain was huge. And we're able to see that if you now fly over Townsville, most houses have white or pale roofs. And we know, we can calculate the energy gain of that. It's huge. So being specific can be really helpful. And I think that's, in talking to some of you last night, I think that's one of the key things that you could take away in an audit process, is not to think about generic behaviours like, save energy in this case, but to think more specifically exactly about who needs to do what differently. Which audience needs to do what thing differently. And that can be really helpful. And that's how behavioural science can work better. Another question we have in behavioural science that's really nagging and I think relevant, and it moves on to the second point I wanted to talk about, which is around understanding drivers and barriers. And I think a lot of behavioural science has kind of got stuck with the idea that all the drivers and barriers sit between the ears of people's heads. Psychologists certainly do. Sociologists, they don't. But then psychologists and sociologists actually hate each other. We don't. In Australia we don't. Actually in other countries we do, but in Australia we don't. And it was really interesting, and I like this example of, as people will remember, the sandpaper scandal of 2018 when some Australian cricketers took sandpaper out and were tampering with a ball in order to get an advantage. I mean, some of you overseas might not know this, but everyone in Australia would be very acutely aware of what happened here. And so all the players were suspended for long periods of time, 2 of them for a year, 1 for 9 months, and banned from being captains, and all this sort of punishment happened to the players. But what was really interesting that happened afterwards was the debate around why they did it. Some people blamed the people, but other people blamed the culture. And if you think about a performance audit or any organisation that's trying to get change, is it the people that lead it or is it the culture that leads it? I don't think there's a right answer, right? Like, I think you need both. Both. See, it's getting in my subconscious. And so I think it's really interesting to think about these debates of understand why people do things, not just from a cultural or an organisational driver or a leadership perspective, which so many people look at, or not just from what happens between the ears of individuals, but from both perspectives. And that's led a lot of the work in behavioural science over the past 10 years. There are models that help you understand what goes on between the ears. I'm not going to explain this. It's called the theory of planned behaviour. It's used a lot, lots of different contexts. In fact, it was first published in a Journal of Organisational Behaviour, in 1991. It's well used and well established, but this is a really good model for understanding what goes on between the ears. There are models that try and think more broadly about why we do things we do from a socio-ecological lens. So is it because of who we are, where we are, or the thoughts we have about the behaviour? So a tiered approach, starting with the things that who we are. We come with personalities and biases, and we have particular emotions. Where we are informs, it provides us concepts, understand the norms, and our habits are triggered by where we are, not by anything that goes on between our ears. So typically we brush our teeth because we're in the bathroom, not because we decide to go and brush our teeth. And then the thoughts we have about the behaviour. So there are these tiered models as well. I don't want you to dwell on these. They're just I'm just trying to show you some examples. And this is the one that we came up with and we talk about a bit in our book that synthesises all these models into 8 kind of drivers of behaviour. I won't go through these in detail, but I would say the ones on the right-hand side, so the blue one and social norms, which is a different colour because it sort of sits a bit in both camps, and I won't go into that specifically just now, are more conscious drivers. And the ones on the left-hand side are less conscious drivers. So the ones that usually result of between the ears stuff, the ones on the left-hand side are usually the result of environmental context. And you can put these together. This is a work from a PhD student of mine who just submitted, and she's really interested in understanding why people bystand or not inside an organisation. She had 2 case studies. One was here in West Australia, actually, a mine site, West Australia. The other was a financial consultancy. Similar size organisations, similar levels of at least public commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, similar funding, supporting training around bystanding. And yet she found really significant differences by using a model like this that unpacked both the whole level drivers, right from societal to organisational, relational and individual. She was able to unpack those. And she was also able to think about the linkages between them in terms of why people do and don't bystand. What she found really, in this case, was that a lot of it stemmed from organisational commitment and leadership. That was the key in this case. But in other cases, it might be elsewhere. But understanding behaviour through these lenses, so this model is really a combination of a multi-level model as well as a behavioural model, or a psychological model. So you can put these together. This is getting complicated. I don't want you to worry too much about it, except to say there are ways to really understand behaviour. And these are some of the tools we use. On the right-hand side, you see all of those include interviews, and I promised I would give, so when speaking to someone last night, I would say I'd give you some tools. If I was speaking to an auditor, if I was conducting an audit and I decided on the behaviour I wanted to change, and I was speaking to the people who I wanted to change their behaviour, these are the 3 questions I would ask them. What are the good and bad things if you did that behaviour? Who would approve and disapprove? And what makes it easier and harder to do that behaviour? That's it. I'd ask those 3 questions. And those 3 questions would really give me a good understanding of drivers and barriers. Not a full gamut, because it's not the whole model, it's not a whole PhD on bystanding, but it would give you a good feel for what the audience might think about the behaviour. 3 questions. What good things, bad things can happen? Who would approve and disapprove? And what makes it easy and hard to do the behaviour? Again, I don't want you to worry about it, but I did put the link in here, and I understand you get these slides. We then do this thing called matching, where we try and match interventions to behaviour. And that's actually quite, drivers and barriers. It's really complicated. This is a really helpful tool called the Theory and Techniques tool. There's a website that can say, if the driver seems to be this, then we use this tool. And there's 14 potential drivers that they use from the model called the Theoretical Domains Framework, and then they have a whole bunch of different tools, up to, I think it's 74 odd tools that they use. I don't want you to worry about it, except to say, if you really want to get involved in behavioural science, have a look at this stuff, because it's actually really cool, and we use it a lot. The last thing I just wanted to do was also talk about generic behaviour change tools. So far we've talked about this pathway that does the deep dive, and the deep dive is really like, once you've got a behaviour, how do we understand why people are doing it in order to design interventions that match that understanding? But there are also techniques that have been tried in enough contexts, in enough situations, that we know that they work. We're pretty sure that they work in most situations. And I'll share, I think, a few of these. I've just got 3 quick ones I wanted to share. And then I'll ask you a question. And the first people to answer me, if anyone can answer me, I'll give you a book. We've only got 3, so it's the first 3 people. So if I was to say 3 quick tips, 3 things to do when you've identified the behaviour that you want to target. You might not have time to ask those 3 questions. You might not have time to dig into all the reasons why people do stuff or don't do stuff. You might not. But there are tools that we know work. In most contexts, they work, at least a little bit. And change is typically a small change in a big audience or a big change in a small audience. And these tools typically work for a small change in a big audience. That's the game that behavioural scientists are in. The first is make it easy. I can't tell you how many government departments we've worked with who make behaviour complicated. Make it as easy as you possibly can. Set defaults if you can. People will follow defaults. The tax office is brilliant at this. I don't know, if any, I'm in my 50s, if anyone was filling out tax forms when you were first getting a job, maybe when you were 20, you know what it's like to fill out a tax form, right? When you, like 30 years ago. And you know what it's like now. The tax office has done a brilliant job at making it easy. Or easier. Really, they have. And it's no surprise that the tax office is one of the first places in Australia to establish a behavioural science unit. First government departments. Richard Thaler, who wrote the book Nudge. Has anyone read Nudge? You're probably familiar with the book Nudge, who co-authored it with Cass Sunstein. He was asked once, how do you change behaviour? What's your tip? What's your number 1 tip? And he said, well, what's your top 10 tips? I think he was asked. He said, well, the first 9, I'll make it easy. And then number 10, I might start working on motivation. But the first 9, I'm going to try and make it as easy as I possibly can. A second tip is make a desirable behaviour seem normal. And also the flip side of that is don't make the undesirable seem normal either. I see a lot of government work that says, look at the size of this huge problem. Every year, 300,000 tonnes of smoke is released from wood-fired household combustion wood fires. What that tells people unconsciously is that a lot of people are doing it. And what that tells people unconsciously is that it's okay to do it. And what that also leads to is more people doing the behaviour. When you go onto Netflix, why do you choose the one that everyone else is watching? FOMO, right? We follow herds, right? So make your herd a positive herd. Point it in the right direction. Instead of saying thousands of people have died on the road, say this, millions of billions of trips are made each year where people don't die on the road. Flip your narrative to be a positive narrative, and then you can help. Ice epidemic, we hear about this with drugs. There's an ice epidemic. How do we deal with that? Well, maybe we talk about the number of people that have recovered or that have sought help and are recovering. Maybe that's a better norm to include. So think about the positive norm, not the negative one. And the last one, get commitments. I think commitments are great, and there's a lot of theory around commitments, and bear in mind I've just plucked 3 out of 74, right? But I'd say they're pretty relevant ones, the work you do. Particularly when you've got ongoing relationships with your people who you're talking to. So you're talking to, I understand the audit process often involves, working heavily with the management team or the C-suite or whoever it is. Great. Well, if you can elicit commitments to them, and if those commitments are active, so they do an action in order to make the commitment, if they're effortful, as in they take some effort to do, and most importantly, if they're public, we know those commitments are much more likely to succeed. Right, I believe that's the end of my talk, but I believe I've got 2 minutes left. The time was set for 35, by the way, so I think I still have 2 minutes. I know I can get in trouble for that. Right, so I've got a question for you. A series of studies were done, and this is another generic tool. A series of studies were done in the 80s and 90s by a very famous researcher called Robert Cialdini, a social psychologist. And he was interested in how you could get people to accept someone cutting in on them in the photocopying queue. Remember photocopiers? Right? And you used to have to wait in the photocopying queue at work. So here's a question. What one word did people use that made it okay to cut into that queue? Please? It helps. It's not the word that he studied. Urgent? Sort of. Thank you. Sorry. No. No, it starts with B. And actually has words that follow after it, but they kind of don't matter. Because. Who said because? Well done. We can get a book there. I've got another one. This morning, I woke up in my hotel and it said, there was a note in my hotel, we've all seen these notes. A towel on the hook means I'll use it again. A towel on the floor means please replace me. We've seen signs like this, right? In a series of studies, again done by Robert Cialdini in the 90s, what did they write on a sign that was most effective to get people to use their towels again? What was save water? No. Sorry, who said that? No. You're close enough, I'll give that. Well done. We can get a book there. Thank you. And there's, I actually have one more, but I can't think of a third example. So whoever comes up first and says, I really want a book, you can have it. Thank you. If you have any more questions, feel free to email. I'm sticking around for morning tea, and thank you for having me.